Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at the fallout from the recent wildfires in L.A. You guys have sent in some news articles analyzing the whole situation, and we're also going to be looking at the reactions from some pretty key players like Donald Trump, Gavin Newsom, and even Joe Biden. The thing that really jumps out is how this natural disaster has become like this political battleground.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been pretty crazy to see.
Yeah, so let's sort of unpack what's going on here.
Yeah, definitely. So first off, these wildfires were absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
At least 5 lives were lost.
Oh, wow.
Tens of thousands of people were forced to flee their homes, and the damage is widespread.
Jeez.
But yeah, almost immediately, this political battle began.
Yeah, you know what really struck me was how quickly Trump came out and started criticizing Newsom's response to the whole thing, especially on social media.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
It was like he was just waiting to pounce.
Yeah, his accusations were very pointed. Like, he was specifically saying that Newsom's environmental policies were to blame for some dry hydrants, which obviously hindered the firefighting efforts.
Okay.
It really makes you wonder, what exactly were these policies that Trump was referencing?
Yeah, from what I was reading in these articles, it seemed like Trump was really zeroing in on policies around like water usage and forest management.
Yeah.
He even called Newsom and Biden the, quote, Biden-Newsom duo.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, and even went so far as to demand Newsom's resignation.
Wow.
Pretty strong language considering the situation. So how has Newsom actually responded to all of this?
Well, Newsom has pretty much avoided engaging directly with Trump's accusations.
No.
There was an interview with CNN where he said, quote, "People are literally fleeing. People have lost their lives. Kids lost their schools. Families completely torn asunder. Churches burned down." This guy wanted to politicize it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
It seems like he's really focused on the immediate needs of like the people who are actually affected by the fires and trying to avoid, getting into this public back and forth with Trump.
Right.
But you bring up a good point. Like, what about these accusations about the dry hydrants? Did Newsom's policies actually have something to do with that?
It's definitely more complicated than just saying, this caused that.
Right.
Water officials have actually confirmed that Southern California did have enough water available.
Oh, okay.
So some hydrants did run dry, but the real problem seems to be more about getting that water to where it was needed quickly enough. Not necessarily that there was a shortage because of environmental regulations.
I see.
It's about logistics.
So the situation's a lot more nuanced than what's being said in those initial, attacks from Trump.
Definitely.
It makes you wonder, like, why double down on these claims, especially when there's evidence that might say otherwise.
Right. Well, even after meeting with a bunch of Republican senators, Trump continued to blame Newsom for how bad the wildfires got. Some analysts are saying this is a deliberate political tactic.
Okay, now this is where it starts to get really interesting.
Yeah.
What do they think Trump is trying to accomplish by doing that?
Well, by making it look like the current administration is incompetent, especially when it comes to handling these types of crises, Trump might be trying to, highlight how much better his incoming team is, trying to present them as the more capable leaders.
Yeah, that's actually really insightful. So it's not just about the wildfires themselves.
Right.
This could be about setting the stage for the new administration.
Yeah.
And maybe even trying to, boost his own political standing, too.
Potentially.
But this isn't the first time that these two have clashed, is it?
Oh, definitely not. This feels like just another chapter in this, ongoing feud between Trump and Newsom. I mean, their differences go way beyond just this one event. They've been at odds over a whole bunch of issues, from immigration and environmental policies to electric vehicle tax credits and even reproductive rights. California has consistently been a really vocal opponent of Trump's agenda.
It sounds like California's more progressive stance on a lot of these issues has basically made it like a target for Trump and his supporters.
I think so, yeah.
I've also noticed that Trump keeps bringing up forest management as the main reason for these wildfires. It seems like that's a recurring theme for him.
Definitely. It's important to think about the bigger picture here, though.
Yeah.
While forest management practices definitely have a role in preventing wildfires, many experts believe that climate change is the bigger factor. It's causing drier conditions and more frequent extreme weather events.
Right, and that leads to another point of contention. Trump has a history of downplaying or completely dismissing the impact of climate change, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, there's been a lot of that.
Yeah.
Remember that exchange he had back in 2020 with Wade Crowfoot, California's Natural Resources Secretary? When they were talking about climate change, Trump just said that the weather would start getting cooler.
Oh, wow.
It seems like he tends to prioritize what he believes over what scientists are saying.
That's a really important point. So how do you think these pre-existing tensions and different views on climate change might affect California's ability to get the federal aid that it needs to recover from these wildfires?
Right.
Could this whole situation create even more roadblocks?
That's a great question, and one I think we should definitely explore further.
Yeah, definitely. But first, let's just take a minute for you all to process what we've talked about so far. We've gone over Trump's attacks on Newsom, the whole dry hydrant issue, and how climate change is playing a role in these devastating wildfires. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, for sure. We're just scratching the surface of this complex issue, and I'm excited to keep diving in with you.
Awesome. Well, we'll be right back. Okay, so we're back. And it's pretty wild how these wildfires have become this flashpoint for all this political debate.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that it goes beyond just Trump and Newsom. It's kind of a symptom of this larger tension that's been building for a while.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah.
What do you think we're really seeing play out here?
Well, if you think about California's role, it often takes this progressive stance, right? Pushing policies that clash with the ones favored by the federal government, especially under a more conservative administration.
Right. We've totally seen that clash over things like immigration and environmental regulations.
Exactly. And this whole dynamic gets even more intense as climate change becomes a more pressing issue. California's on the front lines of those impacts, which just adds another layer to this conflict.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like these wildfires have become this symbol of that bigger conflict. On one side, you have the people who believe climate change is a huge factor and are demanding action. And on the other side, there's this focus on things like forest management with way less emphasis on the role of climate change.
That's a really sharp observation. I mean, these wildfires aren't just a natural disaster. They've become this battleground for different narratives about, the role of government, the validity of science, and basically the future of the planet.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective.
Yeah.
It's not just about scoring political points anymore. It's about fundamental values and visions for the future.
Right.
So for someone listening to all this, how do they make sense of it? How do you navigate this crazy politicized world?
That's the question, isn't it? I think it's more important now than ever to stay informed and try to get different perspectives. Don't just listen to one side. And be wary of anyone who's oversimplifying things or presenting a one-sided view.
That makes sense, but honestly, it can be so overwhelming.
I know.
We're constantly bombarded with information.
Right.
How do you even know what to trust anymore?
Yeah, critical thinking is so important. You need to be able to evaluate your sources, recognize potential biases, and always ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative?
Those are great tips. I also think it's important to remember that these issues are hardly ever black and white.
Oh, absolutely.
There are so many shades of gray, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
I completely agree. It's essential to be open to having your assumptions challenged and really listen to perspectives that are different from your own.
I know it can be uncomfortable, but it feels like the only way to have productive conversations and find solutions to these huge, complex problems.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of solutions, I'm curious about what this all means for the future. With all these tensions we've talked about, how are California and the federal government going to be able to work together during future crises, especially ones related to climate change? Are we just going to keep seeing this politicization, or is there a way to actually collaborate?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and unfortunately, there are no easy answers.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, but I think you've given us a really good way of understanding what's going on here, recognizing the political motivations, the different narratives, and how important critical thinking is.
Absolutely. And I think this whole deep dive into the LA wildfires shows how these seemingly isolated events can actually reveal much larger societal and political trends. It's a reminder to be vigilant, stay informed, and be active in shaping a better future.
You've given us so much to think about. I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into this politically charged wildfire season.
I agree. It's been a really insightful exploration, and I'm glad we had this conversation.
Me too. So let's go over some key takeaways for everyone listening and offer some final thoughts. All right. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that these wildfires, they've become this really stark example of how even natural disasters are now like super politicized. You know, it's like this blame game erupts almost immediately, and it often overshadows the real human suffering that's actually happening.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of tragedy, it feels like political agendas take center stage.
Yeah. The second takeaway, and this is like really closely related to the first, is that climate change is a major driver of these wildfires, right? They're becoming more frequent, more intense, but it's still such a divisive issue in our political landscape.
Yeah, and that division makes it so much harder to find any kind of common ground and actually implement like effective solutions.
Totally. And the third takeaway, and this is maybe the most concerning one, is that this pattern of politicization, it's like it's seeping into almost every aspect of our lives.
Oh, yeah.
We see it in public health crises, national security threats, and now even with these natural disasters.
It almost feels like we've like lost the ability to have these like rational, evidence-based conversations about anything important anymore.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous trend because it erodes trust in institutions, it fuels misinformation, and ultimately it makes it much harder to actually address these challenges.
So like knowing all of this, knowing how bad it is, what can we actually do? Like, is there any hope for having like a more constructive and collaborative approach, to these problems?
I think there is, but it requires a conscious effort from all of us. We need to be more discerning about the information we're taking in, more willing to have like respectful dialogue with people who have different views, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable for what they're doing.
That sounds like a really tall order, but I think you're right. We can't afford to just give up,
Yeah.
We can't be apathetic. We have to stay engaged, stay informed, and keep pushing for a better future.
Well said. And I think this deep dive has given our listeners the knowledge and insights they need to do just that.
Yeah, I think so too. This has been a really eye-opening look at how politics, the environment, and our collective future are all tied together.
Absolutely.
But, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Always more to explore. But I think it's fitting to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If all this tension continues and we keep politicizing every crisis, how are we going to be able to deal with the even bigger challenges that are coming down the road, especially with climate change? Can we break free from this cycle of division and actually find a way to work together and find solutions?
Yeah, those are really powerful questions, and ones I hope our listeners will really think about, because the answers don't just lie with politicians or experts, they lie with all of us. We need to decide what kind of future we want and work together to get there.
Couldn't agree more. The future is in our hands.
Thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.